I watched the post-cabinet press briefing yesterday morning,
Yes.
and when Senator Dana Dixon was speaking, she was speaking about, there's a lot of misinformation out there and all of that. And it really brought my mind to the fact that we currently live in a society where information is not monopolized by media houses, by broadcast houses. Information is no longer monopolized by governments. Information is now a currency. And it's a currency to those who get it quickly, hold on to it, and disseminate it in like fashion. Reminds me of investing. And in this day and age, Tana, information is so powerful, hence its currency, that countries abound, especially in our very warsome environment, have used information as a means of winning war. You will see and recognize in the Russia-Ukraine incident, war, that there is an information war there as to what's the current status, what's currently happening on the ground when it comes to casualties and deaths. And I remember I was watching the BBC when the anchor noted that it is important for either the Western Hemisphere or for Russia to win the information war, because the very perception of it was very important to either demotivate the Russian base or motivate the Ukrainian army. And I was reading up about it yesterday, Tana, and I saw an excellent article by Major Basil Jarrett, a communications man himself, communicated for the Jamaica Defence Force, and now I believe at MOCA. And in this article, I found it very instrumental, very instructive, and I want to share it with the listeners this morning. Because he says, as someone with more than a passing interest in the impact of communications on Jamaica's socio-political landscape, he's vigilant of any imminent threat on the media horizon. Take, for instance, the spectre of manipulation, misinformation, and the distortion of truth, which has plagued nations even larger, wealthier, and savvier than our little Jamaica land we love. So he says, if the big boys can't stop it, how can we? After all, wars have been fought, won, and lost over misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda. And with social media and its proliferation and historic highs, the advice to remain vigilant can sometimes feel useless, except that it's not. Remaining vigilant remains the single best piece of advice anyone can give on how to avoid becoming a victim or tool of deception and misinformation. And although social media did not exist in the 1600s and the 1700s, there are still some enduring lessons that we can take from that particular era. One such example is the Vietnam War, one of the most misunderstood and polarizing wars of the last century. Without going too deep into a history lesson, he says on that conflict, the war was triggered by the 1955 invasion of South Vietnam by the Communist North Vietnamese National Liberation Front in an attempt to overthrow its leader, Ngo Dinh Diem, and reunite the country by force. The United States became involved and found themselves embroiled in the conflict until 1975, 20 years later. But what does any of this have to do with misinformation and propaganda in 2024? In 2 words, a lot, he says. You see, the story of the United States' defeat and ultimate withdrawal from Saigon in 1975 isn't simply one of a small force getting won over a superior enemy. It is a story of clever military tactics, exemplified by the effectiveness of jungle guerrilla warfare and the persistent psychological trauma meted out to the US soldiers by Hannah, a low radio announcer. If the name Hanoi Hannah doesn't ring a bell, it's fine. He says you won't be the only one who's never heard of her. And no, it wasn't a tropical storm that hit Jamaica in the 1970s, but her impact on the American soldiers during the Vietnam War was just as destructive. The silky voice radio broadcaster, real name Tring Ting No, spun tales so convincing that it slowly chipped away at the morale of many of the United States Army men who were far from home and far from convinced of the righteousness of this war. Her broadcast, laden with misinformation and psychological tactics, sought to sow seeds of doubt and discontent among the troops, especially black soldiers. She was not meant to frighten or terrify the soldiers. She meant to soothe and console them, degrade their will to fight, and convince them that their cause was unjust. And just like that today, Jamaica has a threat of disinformation and misinformation. It is no less real than what happened in that Vietnam War. And while you'd be hard-pressed to find a transistor radio in any home today, social media platforms and media proliferation have amplified the voices and messages to an almost unfathomable degree. And with this amplification comes the heightened risk of propaganda, messages designed to influence public opinion, not with facts, but with appeals to emotion and bias. Which reminds me of Brandolini's law, he says, also known as the Bayes asymmetry principle. Brandolini's law posits that the energy needed to refute misinformation and propaganda is an order of magnitude bigger than is needed to produce it. In other words, it is far easier to spread the nonsense than it is to debunk it. So let us now apply that to Jamaica. Facebook post outpaces the rigorous vetting of a newsroom, he says. Suddenly everyone's an expert and the truth becomes a needle in a haystack, in a stay of haystacks. Misinformation, disinformation, propaganda is a real and calculated manipulation of public opinion, where fiction can overrun fact if we're not careful. A falsehood about a public figure, a twisted narrative about a current event, a conspiracy theory about a life-saving vaccine can take hold in the public conscience much faster than an ackee can fall from a tree, he says. And once it takes root, uprooting it is a Herculean task. And so, disproving nonsense requires far more energy than to produce it. And it is this imbalance, he says, that the propagandists bank on. It's what they exploit to undermine democracy, sow discord, and erode trust in institutions. We need, therefore, to pivot away from a culture that reacts to propaganda to one that preempts it. Open your eyes, listen with judgment, question everything, promote transparency in your dealings, and hold each other to account. And as we venture into the information jungle warfare, Major Basil Jarrett says, let's be guided not by the chatter of the masses, but by the quiet voice of reason. Let's be as critical of the news we consume as we are of the food we eat. After all, we are in an age where propaganda can spread as fast as bolt can run. Staying informed is not just a choice, it's now a duty. When I read this article, Tana, from Major Basil Jarrett, it sums up perfectly what is happening in our little country. Information is now a currency that has to be used carefully. And it's now not a matter of just broadcast house having a monopoly on information, as I started with. It's now the case where, just as how I have an intimate relationship with you by being in your home and listening, and you're listening while you're getting ready for work this morning and getting your child ready for school, or you're traveling in your private motor vehicle, or you're in a taxi and listening to me right now. Just as how I have this connection with you, when you go on your mobile device, you have that connection with everyone else. And just like that, your ears and eyes are opened to a variety of information, and sometimes the truth is just a needle in a haystack.